Hi, everyone. I just wanted to come on and reflect a little bit on the really great conversation you all had about the academic study of the Bible. It's really great to start to hear some of your voices and get to know you as human beings. It's a little weird to be over here reading your conversation, and I really have to control myself, restrain myself, and not jump in and respond to you individually because I think my comments tend to get lost and diluted and people get frustrated with the various threads and trying to keep up with what the instructor is saying and what their peers are saying. So I'm really going to stick with my decision here to just record reflective comments. So we'll see how that goes. We can talk about it at gathering dates and see if you all like this approach or if it feels too impersonal. So let's jump in. First of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about Michael's post. Michael, you talked about Brown's rule number 6, basically that people are not all that different now than they were during biblical times. And you're absolutely right to point out that a lot has changed since biblical times. And if we assume that too much that people are the same, we get into trouble. I think what Brown is trying to get at here is this thing that students sometimes do, which is to assume that we're so much more evolved than the people in the Bible. So students will encounter things such as women and children were considered technically, at least according to the law, to be property of the male heads of household. And so they start to think, well, maybe they didn't really love their wives because they were just property. And I think, or they start to read the war texts in the Hebrew Bible, which are legion. And they say, well, people were just more violent back then. People were more vitriolic with regard to the other. We're so much more advanced than that. We're so much more evolved. So I think what he wants to say is, don't assume that these human beings who lived and wrote and loved in biblical times didn't have the same kinds of emotions that you do, or that they didn't struggle with the same things. So even though we're in an age of social media and technology, as you note, Michael, people still struggle with comparing themselves to one another in the biblical text. They still struggle with envy and greed, all the kinds of things that I think capitalism has ramped up for us in this age. But those things were experienced still, even in different forms in biblical times. So I think it's a balancing act between acknowledging that there were a lot of differences and also accepting that human beings were still human beings back in the day. Okay, also wanted to talk a little bit about Janice's suggestion that we read the Bible as a guidebook. So I think, yes, I think that's right to some degree, but I wanted to just kind of nuance that and add to that. I wonder if it's more useful to think about the Bible as a mirror. So if it's a guidebook, it's not a very straightforward one. So given that if you're going to the Bible for suggestions, for advice about how to live, or for morals, and to have those look sort of simple, then you're going to be disappointed. But if you think about the biblical text as a very complicated guidebook, as a mirror so that sort of shows us the kinds of things that we tend to struggle with in our communities, things that we tend to get hooked by, weaknesses we all tend to have as human beings. So that I think it's more productive to maybe think about the Bible as a conversation partner, as a text that is incredibly messy and understands and really doesn't shy away from dealing with the dark aspects, the shadowy underbelly of life and of our own humanity. So I think if we can really acknowledge the difficulties that we encounter as we try to come together in communities, as we try to live more fully as ourselves, as we try to embrace our values and not get caught up in what other people are doing or what we think we ought to be doing. I think if we read the Bible as a sympathetic conversation partner in this realm, perhaps that would be a more useful way to think of it. I really appreciated some of your vulnerability here in these posts. Karen, I love the fact that you say it's going to be hard for you to read the Bible without resorting to what I believe. And that is so true. And I think that if we think that that won't be an issue, we're going to get into trouble. So I think what we want to try to do is say, this is what I believe. And that's great. That's evolving, that's changing. So I like the Grand Canyon metaphor a lot, Catherine. And if we can say, this is where I am in terms of what I believe, and this is what I encounter in the biblical text. Wow, look at the difference. The Bible does not necessarily support what I believe, and it doesn't change it. Or it does. It can actually nuance it and make me think about things that I hadn't thought about before and really actually change what I believe. So as long as we don't force the what I believe thing onto the Bible or expect the Bible to confirm our beliefs, then I think it's good. It can be a really productive conversation. It's just a matter of having a boundary there and knowing this is my belief, this is what the Bible says. Not as if the Bible is going to say anything sort of easy to figure out, but to try to really allow for the Bible to say something different and to confront our beliefs and maybe even change those beliefs. So I think it was Nikki, sorry, I've got my notes over here. Nikki, you also talked about how difficult it can be to sit with uncertainty. And one of the things that Brown points out, I think helpfully, is that often it will be impossible to figure out the true or original meaning of a text. So one of the things that biblical scholars, at least the biblical scholars that I appreciate, say is its interpretation all the way down and all the way up. So there is no such thing as access to some original context, some original truth. It is all filtered through our own interpretations and centuries of interpretations. So that can be a little uncomfortable because we can't say, oh, here's the good meaning. Here's the real meaning of the text. Or here's the negative meaning. Here's the real sort of dark side of this text, and that's the true meaning. So we have to resist that, or we have to accept this. It's all very gray, all very blurry, which, again, why I think if we think it's just a simple guidebook, we're going to get into some trouble. I think what for those of us who care about, and I'm not saying all of you will, and you don't have to, but I think, let me go back and say, so I like Gopnik because he thinks about the Bible as literature. And if you think about great literature, it is going to be ambiguous. That is part of its appeal. That is part of its timelessness. Is it's not saying this is the truth and therefore, go forth and conquer. It is actually a nuanced, rich document that is going to look different every time you come to it. So going back to David's post and Catherine's post about the Bible, or reading the Bible as kind of the Grand Canyon, we'll be encountering the Bible in as different people. We change over time, quite radically, it turns out. And as changing people, our readings of the text are going to change too. So and that's going to be uncomfortable at times if you're looking for an answer to your questions, or if you're looking to be right about something. The biblical text is not necessarily the place to go, although people certainly do that. Not on a critical read, though. I don't think you can do that effectively. Okay, so one more thing I wanted to say before I sign off. I wanted to comment on Jen's post. I thought your critique of Michael Brown was really interesting, and I think that many of us women and people who care about women, but women in particular, because I've been living with a certain amount of abuse, both low level and high level, for a very long time, and accepting it without acknowledging it and really acknowledging the damage. So in the post-Me Too movement, I think we are no longer content to justify putting down women, the sort of microaggressions, all the way up to the level of macroaggression and sexual abuse and sexual harassment. We're not going to take it anymore, I guess is what I want to say. So I appreciate you really holding Brown to a higher standard here. And it can be very liberating to say, no, hey, that's not okay not to mention Tamar's name. I do not appreciate that. At the same time, I'm not sure I want to go quite so far as to dig into his knowledge, acknowledgments to see if he knows women or, thanks women. Who knows? The field of Bible has been dominated by men for a long time. So if you are working in the field, biblical studies, and if you've been working in it a long time, you know mostly men. So that's reflective of the reality at this point. I also think you don't know Michael Brown. So if you're going to dig into his acknowledgments, you need to know him. So he is a black gay man. So he's dealing with multiple oppressions as well. So I think when we start to get a little bit personal with our accusations, it can become a little problematic. So I guess all that to say, I'm totally fine with you saying, it bothered me that he didn't mention Tamar. Great. His sort of personal statements at the beginning of his book, in trying to read into those and support your understanding of him as a misogynist or, as somebody who doesn't value women, that makes me a teensy bit uncomfortable. But bring it on. Let's do it. Let's talk about all this stuff and open it up. And most of all, talk about what matters to you, what hooks you, what grabs you. The more we can be honest and vulnerable and wrestling around with this stuff together and talking about what we don't understand and what bothers us, I think the more interesting this course is going to be. So I look forward to continuing to listen in on your conversations.